Isabel just wanted to clean up her mother-in-law's old estate before selling it, but behind an old stove she found a secret door that had remained hidden for decades. On the other side, something impossible to forget awaited her. Hundreds of photographs of a dead child, a small altar, and a diary capable of destroying all the secrets of her husband's family. The most terrifying thing was not discovering how that child died. The most terrifying thing was understanding that the same tragedy could happen to her own son. Why did her mother-in-law hide that room until the end of her days? What truth had remained buried for so many years? And when Isabel discovered the answer, she understood that she had to choose between continuing to live in fear or changing her destiny forever. And before continuing, let me wish you health and peace. Tell me, from which country and at what time are you watching this story? The morning of Carmen Romero's funeral dawned brightly in Seville. The spring sun illuminated the white facades and the scent of orange blossoms hung in the air. For Isabel Morales, however, that day held a weight that was difficult to explain. She stood next to Daniel during the ceremony, listening to the priest's words without really paying attention. Her gaze kept lingering on the portrait of Carmen, surrounded by white flowers. They had never been particularly close, but her mother-in-law had always treated her with respect. In the 15 years she had been married to Javier, she had never received a cruel word from her. When the ceremony ended, the neighbors began to say goodbye to the family. Some hugged Javier, others remembered the vegetables from Carmen's garden or his generosity with the neighbors. Isabel noticed that her husband barely reacted. "Now we have to get all the paperwork in order as soon as possible," Javier commented as they walked to the car. "The sooner we sell the properties, the better." Isabel lowered her gaze. "She was your mother, Javier. And that's precisely why I know there's no point in leaving things abandoned." Quote. Daniel walked a few steps behind. At 10 years old, he understood little about inheritances, but he did understand that his grandmother would no longer visit them on Sundays. That night, as they ate dinner in silence, he asked, "Mom, is Grandma Carmen already in heaven?" Isabel smiled sadly. "That's what religious people say. So he must be taking care of his flowers." Quote. The woman felt a lump in her throat. Carmen loved plants. Every weekend she traveled to her small farm in Carmona to tend the garden she had inherited from her parents. She spoke of the land with special affection. "That's precisely why you'll have to go on Saturday," Javier said suddenly. "We have to clean the house before we put it up for sale." "So quickly? Why wait? That farm is only good for collecting dust." Quote. Over the next few days, Isabel continued working at the neighborhood supermarket. However, she couldn't stop thinking about the old house in Carmona and Javier's hurry to sell it. On Saturday, she left early. After a coffee with milk, she drove along the road surrounded by olive groves under the clear Andalusian sky. When she arrived, she stood still for a few seconds. The whitewashed facade, the flower pots by the entrance, the old fig tree. Everything looked exactly the same as it had years ago. She pushed open the gate and walked slowly across the land. The garden was still producing vegetables and plants, aromatics. It was evident that Carmen had worked there until shortly before she died. "You didn't want to leave them, did you, Carmen?" he murmured. He spent more than an hour pulling weeds and watering the flower beds. This simple task gave him a sense of tranquility he hadn't felt in a long time. Then he entered the house. The interior was surprisingly tidy. He opened the windows, removed some old sheets, and began cleaning. The kitchen was the largest room. At one end stood the old wood-burning stove. As he moved some boxes that had piled up against the wall, he heard a dull noise. He stopped. He looked around. No one was there. He thought that perhaps some of the wood had shifted with age, and continued working. But when he moved an old cupboard a few inches, something caught his eye. Behind the stove, a strange vertical line appeared. He frowned, approached it, and ran his hand over its surface. It wasn't a wall, it was a door. A narrow, perfectly concealed door that he had never seen in all the years he had been visiting this house. His heart began to beat rapidly. He looked at the dusty lock. For a moment, he had the feeling of being in front of something that had remained hidden for many years. Something that Carmen never wanted to show to anyone, and without knowing exactly why, she searched in her bag for the bunch of keys that Javier had given her before traveling. The key turned with difficulty in the lock. For a few seconds, Isabel thought she was using the wrong key. However, a click resounded in the silence of the kitchen. The door opened slowly. A soft smell, sidewalk, old wood and humidity came from inside. The woman remained motionless. She did not know exactly what she expected to find behind that hidden door, but she was sure that it was not that. The small room was completely dark. She looked for a switch next to the frame. When the light bulb turned on, a yellowish light illuminated the space. Isabel took a step back. All the walls were covered with photographs, dozens, maybe hundreds, all showing the same child. She felt a shiver. She recognized that face immediately. Miguelito Romero, Javier's younger brother, had seen some old photographs during family gatherings, but never so many at once. In fact, she barely remembered hearing her husband talk about him. The little boy smiled in almost every image. Sometimes he appeared in the garden, other times in Carmen's arms. He seemed like a happy child. The woman moved slowly around the room. The more she looked, the more she understood that this place was not a simple forgotten pantry, it was a sanctuary. In one corner there was a small chest of drawers covered with a white tablecloth. On top rested several burned-out candles. A rosary, some dried flowers, and a framed photograph of Miguelito occupying the center. The scene reminded her of the small churches in the Andalusian villages that she visited as a child with her grandmother. There was nothing terrifying there, only pain, a lot of pain. Suddenly she understood why Carmen traveled to Carmona so many times. Perhaps she did not go just to tend to the garden, perhaps she returned to be close to that memory. Isabel felt a deep sadness. Losing a child must be an impossible wound to heal. For a few minutes she remained observing the room in silence. She thought about Daniel. Just imagining that something could happen to him was overwhelming, unbearable. With a sigh, she began to carefully remove some photographs. She didn't want to throw them away, she just needed to tidy up the place before a potential buyer showed up. Javier would never understand that. Or maybe he would. Maybe he knew about the existence of that room and simply preferred to pretend it didn't exist. The idea produced a strange unease in her. She continued working. She removed several religious images to take them later to the town church and arranged the photographs in small piles on a table. The last piece left on the altar was the main portrait of Miguelito. She picked it up carefully. Then something fell behind the frame. A small notebook hit the wood softly. The woman bent down and picked it up. The cover was worn, the corners bent with age. It seemed to have been hidden for many years. She opened the first page, immediately recognizing the handwriting. It was Carmen's handwriting, the same that appeared every Christmas on the family cards. Her heart began to race. She turned several pages, dates, notes, thoughts, memories. This was not a simple notebook, it was a diary. For a few seconds she hesitated. Maybe she should leave it where it was. Maybe she had no right to read something so personal, but then her eyes stopped on a sentence written in blue ink. Today everyone thinks that I'm still mourning the death of my son. No one knows the truth. The air seemed to disappear from the room. She read that line a second time, then a third, as if behind those pages lay a secret too big to remain buried. She clutched the notebook to her chest. Outside, the wind gently stirred the branches of the olive trees. Inside the secret room she understood that she had just found something much more valuable than any inheritance. She had found a story that someone had tried to hide for years, and without knowing it yet, that story was about to change her life forever. Isabel put the diary in her bag before leaving the estate. All the way back to Seville, she felt a strange unease. Those words written by Carmen kept echoing in her head. No one knows the truth. What truth? What could have remained hidden for so many years? When she arrived at the apartment, Javier was sitting across from her. To the TV. You finished cleaning almost everything. Okay, the sooner we sell that house, Isabel felt silently. Daniel appeared from his room with a math notebook in his hands. Mom, I got the best grade in the group. The boy smiled proudly. Before she could respond, Javier spoke without taking his eyes off the screen. Okay, now go do something else. Daniel's smile slowly disappeared. Isabel felt a pang in her chest. Lately she had begun to notice things that had previously seemed normal. Her son always sought his father's approval and almost never received it. That night, when everyone was asleep, she took the diary from the back of a drawer and began to read. The first pages talked about Carmen's youth, her wedding, the dreams she had when she was still a girl. But as the years went by, the tone changed, the joy disappeared, the hope too. The pages began to fill with fear. Today he got angry again. I tried not to respond. Marquitos was watching. I hope tomorrow will be different. Isabel swallowed. Each sentence it felt painfully familiar. It was as if she were reading parts of her own life. Over the next few days, she took advantage of every free moment to continue. She read during breaks at the supermarket. She read while waiting for the bus. She read when Javier fell asleep, and each new page made her more uneasy. Carmen described a man who easily lost control. Then he would ask for forgiveness. He promised to change. He swore that he loved his family, but he always came back to hurt them. She also wrote something that surprised Isabel. That man had grown up amidst violence and beatings, exactly like her own son years later. For a long time, he had promised that he would never be like his father. However, he ended up becoming the thing he hated most. One afternoon, while she was arranging yogurts at the supermarket, Isabel closed the notebook and remained motionless. For the first time in her life, she asked herself a question that she had never dared to think about. And if this was not normal, the idea startled her. She had seen similar situations since she was little. Her father treated her mother like this. Many women in the neighborhood experienced the same thing. He had always believed that life was just that. But Carmen's words seemed to challenge that belief. That same night, something happened that increased his doubts even more. When he got home, he found a photograph on the table that he had brought from Carmona. It was a picture of Miguelito smiling. He had left it there because he thought Javier might want to keep it. However, when he saw it, his reaction was immediate. His face hardened. What is that doing here? I just thought I told you to throw all that away. It's a picture of your brother. I don't want to see it. Javier's voice sounded so cold that Isabel felt a chill. Daniel watched the scene from the hallway. Without saying anything, she took the photograph and put it away again. That reaction confirmed to her that behind Miguelito's death there was something that Javier preferred not to remember. That night he returned to the newspaper. The rain was pattering softly on the windows. He turned several pages, reading happy memories, short family anecdotes, and then he found a different entry. The letters seemed to have been written with trembling hands. The date was a few days before the death of the child. Isabel began to read slowly. Carmen spoke of an argument, of shouting, of fear, of a night she had never been able to forget. The tension increased with each line. When she reached the end of the page, she felt her blood freeze in her veins. The last word seemed to pierce the paper. It was no accident. My son died because of his father. The diary slipped from her hands. For several seconds she was unable to move, and for the first time she understood that the secret hidden in that room in Carmona was much darker than she had imagined. Isabel did not sleep that night. The rain continued to beat against the windows as she sat in the kitchen with the diary open in front of her. Carmen's words were etched into her memory. It was no accident. My son died because of his father. For years, Javier had told her the same story. Miguelito had tripped near the old stove on the Carmona farm and hit his head. An accident. Nothing more. Now, Isabel understood that the truth was very different. The next morning she took the diary with her to work. During a break, she continued reading. The following pages described a night of horror. Carmen was holding Miguelito in her arms when her husband arrived home furious. There were shouts, insults, threats, then blows. A push threw her to the floor. Miguelito fell from her arms. His head hit the edge of the stove violently. Isabel felt a chill. She read how the child began to worsen hours later. The fever, the convulsions, the ambulance, the hospital, and finally death. Her hands were shaking. But the worst came a few pages later. Carmen said that her husband forced her to remain silent. No one should know the real cause. Everyone would believe it had been an accident. And so it went on for decades. Suddenly, a terrifying idea appeared in his mind. Daniel remembered every argument with Javier, every slammed door, every broken object, every moment when fear had entered his home. For the first time, he imagined something he had never allowed himself to think about, and if history ever repeated itself, that possibility began to haunt her. She could no longer see Javier was simply a man with a bad temper. She saw someone capable of losing control just like her own father, and that terrified her. A few weeks later, the inevitable happened. When she returned from work, she found the apartment strangely silent. Daniel was doing his homework in his room. Javier was sitting on the floor. On the table was something that made the blood drain from Isabel's face. The diary. Javier held it in his hands. "Where did you find this?" The voice sounded unrecognizable. "On the farm. I told you not to touch any of that. I just wanted to understand." "Understand what?" The man stood up. His eyes were full of rage. "Who gave you permission to read my mother's life story?" "Javier. Answer me." Daniel appeared at the door of the hallway, scared, watching in silence. That image hit Isabel hard. For the first time she felt more afraid for her son than for herself. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," she whispered. "Liar." Javier threw the diary to the floor. The argument became increasingly violent. Screams filled the apartment. Daniel began to cry. "Dad, please." Those words were useless. Isabel tried to get closer to the boy, but Javier completely lost control. Everything happened too fast. A piece of furniture crashed. Objects fell to the floor. Daniel screaming. For a moment Isabel had the feeling that she was watching the same tragedy she had read about in the newspaper repeat itself. When she managed to sit up, Daniel was hugging her, trembling. They were both crying and something definitively broke inside her heart. That night, while Javier slept on the couch after several beers, Isabel made a decision. She put some clothes in a bag, put the important documents away, woke Daniel up and left the apartment. An hour later, Lucia opened the door to her house in Alcalá de Guadera. When she saw her friend's battered face, she didn't ask any questions, she simply hugged her. Daniel took refuge next to them. For several minutes, no one spoke. Finally, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of hot coffee, Isabel burst into tears. "I don't know what to do." Lucia watched her in silence. "Yes, you know, I have fear. I know, what if I can't do it alone?" Lucia took her hand. "You've been surviving alone for years, Isabel. The only thing that changes now is that you'll stop doing it with fear." Those words hung in the air. For the first time in many years, Isabel didn't think about justifying Javier, she didn't think about forgiving him, she didn't even think about going back. While Daniel slept in the guest room, hugging a blanket that Lucia had lent him, she lay awake staring into the darkness, and for the first time she allowed herself to imagine a different life, a life far from fear, a life far from Javier. Maybe after so many years the time had come to change her destiny. For several days, Isabel stayed at Lucia's house trying to sort out her thoughts. There she discovered something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Daniel also seemed different. He slept better, he smiled more. And one afternoon, while doing homework at the kitchen table, he said something that Isabel would never forget. "Mom, I'm not afraid here." Those words were etched into her heart. In the meantime, Javier showed up every day. He brought flowers, promises, apologies, and when nothing worked, the reproaches came. "You're destroying our family. Daniel needs his father." Lucia watched all this with suspicion. "They always do the same," she said. "First they ask for forgiveness, then they go back to being who they really are." Even so, Isabel decided to return. A part of her still wanted to believe that things could get better. She also wanted to believe that Daniel could still grow up with his father without fear. For a few months, Javier seemed different. He arrived early, spoke more calmly. He tried to get closer to Daniel. He even asked about school and the boys' grades, but Daniel continued to answer cautiously, as if he were afraid that all that would disappear at any moment. And he was right. Little by little, the old habits returned, the criticism, the yelling, the humiliation. Nothing seemed enough for Javier. One night, during dinner, he hit the table hard. "Lately you think you're very brave." Isabel didn't answer. Daniel lowered his gaze. That scene reminded him too much of the past, and in that moment he understood something important. Javier wasn't changing, he was just trying hard to contain himself. And sooner or later he always ended up being the same. A few weeks later he went secretly to a lawyer in Seville. He filed for divorce. As he left the office he felt fear, but also an unexpected sense of relief. Javier still didn't know anything. Then he showed up with an unexpected proposal. "Next week is your birthday. We could spend the day by the Guadalquivir, like before." That invitation awakened memories of when they were dating, and she still believed she was in love. She accepted only to avoid suspicion. 2 days later they traveled to a quiet area by the river. Daniel had stayed with an aunt for the weekend. The day seemed normal. Javier fished near the shore while Isabel prepared dinner by a small campfire. However, as evening fell, the noise of several engines shattered the calm. 3 motorcycles appeared on the road. 5 young men got off amid laughter, music, and the sound of cans hitting each other. At first they seemed like simple hikers, but little by little they began to get too close. The comments turned into uncomfortable. The jokes stopped being funny, the tension increased. One of them kicked a pot by the fire. Another blocked the way when Isabel tried to move away. The boys were still laughing, but now there was something aggressive in their eyes. Javier observed the situation more and more nervously. Then one of them stepped forward and looked directly at him as if waiting for him to react, as if waiting for him to defend his wife. For a few seconds, no one spoke. But Javier paled, stepped back, looked around, turned on himself and ran to the car. In a matter of seconds, he started the vehicle and disappeared, raising a cloud of dust. Isabel stood still. She could not believe what she had just seen. The man she had feared for 15 years had just abandoned her. Alone. In front of these strangers, the young men also seemed surprised. One of them let out an incredulous laugh as he watched the car drive away, but Isabel was no longer looking at them. Her eyes were fixed on the road where Javier had just fled. And while she was watching the vehicle disappearing among the trees, a painful truth finally settled in her heart. Maybe Javier had never been strong, maybe he had always been just a coward. Isabel remained motionless for several seconds after the car disappeared down the road. The noise of the engine faded away until it was replaced by the murmur of the Guadalquivir and the wind through the trees. The young men also seemed surprised. Was he really your husband? One of them asked. Isabel nodded. The boy shook his head. We were only joking. We never thought he would run away. A short time later, the motorcycles disappeared into the trees and she was left completely alone. She sat by the campfire. For the first time in 15 years, she did not feel afraid. She felt sadness. Sadness for the lost time, for all the times she had justified Javier, for every moment in which Daniel had had to grow up seeing the fear in his mother's eyes. That night, she understood something important. Javier had never been strong, he had only been cruel to those who were weaker. When real danger appeared, he fled. At dawn he returned to Seville. He walked up the stairs of the building with a firm step. Javier was sitting in the kitchen surrounded by empty bottles. When he saw her enter, he stood up. Isabel, listen, it's not what it seems. She didn't answer. She packed a small suitcase and put away some documents. When she returned to the hallway, Javier was still there. There were 5 of those guys. I know. I went to get help. No, of course I did. You left because you were scared. The man lowered his gaze. And you left me alone. He tried to get closer. We can fix this. He's not thinking about Daniel. I'm thinking about Daniel, actually. Isabel took a deep breath. I filed for divorce weeks ago. Javier's face lost its color. What? It's over. You can't do this to me. I should have done it a year ago. And he left the apartment without looking back. The following months were not easy. There were paperwork, financial problems, and malicious comments. There were also nights of doubt and moments when tiredness seemed stronger than hope. But Isabel kept going. She bought a small apartment in another neighborhood of Seville. It wasn't big or luxurious, but no one lived in fear there. Daniel began to change little by little. He smiled more, he talked more. He felt safe again, and what relieved Isabel the most was seeing that the boy no longer flinched when someone raised their voice. For several years, she devoted all her energy to working and raising her son. She didn't think about falling in love again. It was enough for her to have regained her peace of mind. That's when Alejandro Ruiz came along. At first, He was a regular customer at the supermarket. Then came the conversations, the coffees, the walks around Seville, and a friendship that grew slowly. Alejandro never raised his voice, never tried to impose his will. He treated Isabel with respect and Daniel with a patience that Pasaz had never seen in an adult. Over time, they formed a family. Many years later, during a Sunday family lunch, Isabel noticed Daniel sitting next to his wife. He was already a grown man, kind, patient, respectful, the exact opposite of his father. The two young daughters ran around the house laughing. Alejandro smiled as he watched them. Then Daniel looked up. "Mom." "Yes, thank you." "Why?" The man smiled at having the courage to change our lives. Isabel's eyes filled with tears because she understood that this had always been her greatest battle. Not being left alone, not starting over, but preventing Daniel from growing up believing that fear and violence were normal. And she had succeeded. She looked out the window. The blue sky of Andalusia shone over Seville and she remembered Carmen. She remembered the old farm in Carmona, the hidden door, the photographs of Miguelito and that diary that had remained hidden for so many years. Sometimes she thought that Carmen had left those pages waiting for someone to find them. Someone capable of understanding the message, someone capable of breaking the cycle that had destroyed her family for generations. Isabel smiled softly because thanks to that decision, Daniel had grown up free from fear and that was worth much more than any inheritance. And so, as the years went by, life ended up demonstrating something that we often forget when we go through difficult times. It wasn't inherited property or money that changed Isabel and Daniel's destiny. It was the courage to make a painful decision at the right time. Where there had been fear and hurt for years, something different gradually began to grow: respect, tranquility, and a true home. Personally, I think the most beautiful thing about this story is that Isabel wasn't a brave woman from the beginning. She had doubts, made mistakes, and took years to take the steps she needed. But when she found the courage to change her life, she also changed the lives of her son and those who came after her. Sometimes we think it's too late to start over, and life shows us that this isn't always the case. The great lesson this story teaches us is simple. Every person deserves to be loved, respected, and to feel safe in their home. True love doesn't humiliate or make us live in fear. Furthermore, a word of support, an outstretched hand, or an opportunity offered at the right time can change a destiny because happiness often comes when we stop hoping only in ourselves and start building something better for those we love. It's like a small lamp lit by a window. Its light seems modest, but it can guide someone through the darkest night. This is an adapted story, inspired by human experiences and reflections on family, forgiveness, and second chances. Maybe that's why it resonates so much with so many of us. Now I'd like to know what you think. If you like this story and it touched your heart, write the number 1 in the comments. If you think it can be improved or want to share any thoughts, write the number 0. It will be a pleasure to read them. And before we say goodbye, I invite you to take a few seconds to think about this story and the people who have made a difference in your life. Perhaps we all keep a door closed in our past, waiting to find the strength to open it and move forward. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to join us in the next stories in this corner, where there is always room for hope, memory, and shared humanity. Yeah,